Thanks for joining us today. This is a clip from our grants compliance expert, Dan Durst, on updates to uniform guidance.
This was something that, everyone kind of knew was coming. Uniform guidance has a requirement in there that is to be evaluated and revised every 5 years, for relevance. And so everyone kind of saw this coming, right? We were at the 5-year mark. And so on January 22nd, 2020, OMB issued proposed guidance. And this proposed guidance was basically what they thought should be revised in uniform guidance. And so on March 23rd, 2020, the comment period closed with over 200 public comments. And these public comments were not like, hey, great job, or hey, I don't like that. They were all, pretty technical in nature. They were basically questioning why these changes need to be made, what changes, what the impact of these changes would be, and so on and so forth. So this is a thing that was very, kind of heavily evaluated by not only OMB, but I think also the public as well. There's a lot of really good input from the public. So it definitely wasn't something that they did in a silo. These revisions have since been posted in the Federal Register as final guidance, and they will go into effect on November 12th, aside from that one that I said was an immediate implementation, in the previous session. Now, one thing to note is that when you go to like the ECFR or your printed copies of uniform guidance, they're not actually going to update the uniform guidance language until January 1st. Okay. So on January 1st, we should see the micro purchase threshold go up. We should see all those things, implemented into the actual text, but don't expect to see it in there on November 12th. Now, revisions affected all 6 subparts in uniform guidance, right? So all the way A through F. And the following are just some of the high profile ones that we kind of handpicked from subpart D, post-award, right? And subpart E, under the cost principles. So procurement standards, we talked about this already, but, essentially this was them taking the approach that they wanted to formally classify micro purchase and small purchase as informal procurement methods. And the reason this is that I think, auditors and organizations, I think the auditors were kind of putting pressure on them. I think folks kind of got carried away with the amount of policy and procedure that are governing their micro purchases and small purchases. And ultimately, these are relatively informal practices, right? You don't need to get 3 quotes on small purchases. You don't need to have RFPs and solicitations and things like that for small purchases. None of that stuff is required. And so really they wanted to kind of drive home the fact that these are considered informal procurement methods. Under non-competitive procurements, they essentially added a clarification in here, which is already understandable under the regulation, but adding it in was kind of a good clarifier, I think. Basically, under sole source procurement, if the acquisition of the property or services, the aggregate dollar amount does not which exceed the micro purchase threshold. So basically what they're saying here is that if you have a procurement that's less than the micro purchase threshold, it's not subject to competition, right? It's a sole source procurement. Everyone, I think, pretty much already knew that, but I think laying it out as one of the elements with which you could do a sole source procurement, I think that also helps, kind of keep it consistent, the language throughout the entire, procurement standards section. All right, so 2 CFR 200, 321. So domestic preference for procurements. Again, we were talking about this one earlier in the sense that this is going to require new domestic sourcing requirements for construction-related products. Now, looking at subpart E, indirect cost recovery. So if you're familiar with the de minimis rate is 10% of modified total direct costs. Modified total direct cost is labor, applicable fringe benefits, travel, materials, services, and the value of a subaward not to exceed $25,000, the first $25,000 that is. And so typically this is a election that was only available to organizations that have never had negotiated indirect rates with the federal government. There was this small set of organizations that had negotiated rates with the federal government years ago, had a break in relationship, and lost the capability to negotiate rates. But because they had negotiated rates previously, they're not able to take advantage of the de minimis rate. They were kind of blocked out. And so what OMB did was they went in and revised this section to say that any non-federal entity can elect to use the de minimis rate. And if they do use it, it has to be used consistently until such time they choose to negotiate a rate. So they really kind of opened that up to any entity can use it. One caveat here is that if you have existing approved rates, you cannot use the de minimis rate. So if you have an approved rate agreement with your cognizant agency for indirect cost right now, you're not going to be able to go back and use the de minimis rate until those rates expire and ultimately become invalid. All right. This last one really kind of troubled me, and I think worried a lot of folks, in this community. Essentially what it says is that they were going to add a section, 2 CFR 200-414H, and it says all rate agreements from the non-federal entity must be available publicly on an OMB designated federal website. So that shocked face there is a result of me, thinking about your organizational confidential pricing information, which is what I would consider indirect rates to be, being shared publicly. If you have a rate agreement with the Department of Education, with HHS, with any of these other organizations, any of these cognizant agencies for indirect costs, they're going to share that on a public website, right? And so if you're bidding against another organization in a competitive manner and they understand your rates and the bases, they're going to be able to back into your cost estimate on these grants, I think, right? If you have a pretty well, prescribed direct labor budget in the grant, right? Then the only thing really unique about each individual proposal is how the indirect cost burdening is done. And so one thing that I'll say on this is, while I do think that this is kind of a mistake for them to do this, I think it's going to be used in an unethical manner moving forward, this information. What I would recommend to you guys is, go into when this OMB designated website is established, go in there and benchmark yourself against other organizations like yours that are participating or not participating, but are competing for the same type of grants, right? You want to know what your competitors are essentially costing these grants to implement the programs, right? And if you find that your indirect rates are significantly higher than your competitors or these other organizations, you may consider potentially taking steps to become more competitive, and maybe you'll win more grants that way. So kind of a shock that they were going to do this. This would never fly in the contracting community, honestly. It is considered confidential and proprietary information, your indirect cost rates. And I was really surprised that they took that step here, at OMB.